Hi, everybody. Welcome back to UL100ZB, Research Skills, Information, and Technology. We are now ready for our next module, Gather. Gather is Chapter 4 in our textbook, The Information Literacy User's Guide, and it is considered to be the fourth pillar of information literacy. It means finding what you need. So part of what we're going to be covering in this particular chapter and in this pillar will be how libraries provide access to resources and engaging with relevant communities to share information, and also using a range of tools and strategies to retrieve and access information. We've covered this a little bit in our previous module on plan, but we'll be doing this a little bit more. The other part that we're going to be doing in Gather is kind of focusing on types of resources regardless of format, depending upon your information need and the topic that you happen to be researching. So regardless of format, there are actually three types of sources, and this is actually another way that you can filter your thinking about information in terms of the kinds of sources that you need to research your topic even more effectively. Primary sources are the first type of source, and page 51 of Chapter 4 defines primary sources as accounts from a person or persons who have firsthand knowledge of the event. So one can think of primary sources as a letter that somebody wrote maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, diaries that are actually written by that individual, also autobiographies. So if you're writing a memoir about yourself, that would be considered to be an autobiography or something that is indeed a primary source, if you yourself are writing about your own life, for example. Primary research in different disciplines, such as the social sciences or physical sciences, can also be considered primary resources. So for example, I might conduct a scientific experiment, and then I would write a scholarly journal article to talk about my experiment, to communicate my findings, and to reach a conclusion for further research. That's another way that one can think of a primary source. So if any of you are in the natural sciences or the physical sciences, or even in a field such as psychology in which experiments or testing might be done, that's also primary sources or primary research. Interestingly enough, emails, social media postings that are written by a particular individual can also be considered to be primary sources of information. So if you write an email, the email that you wrote would indeed be a primary source of information. Secondary sources can be thought of as secondhand sources, almost one step removed from a primary source. So for example, if you are reading a biography about a famous person or an author or a celebrity, but that's not actually written by that celebrity or famous person, that actually is a secondary source of information. So an autobiography is a primary source. A biography about someone is a secondary source of information because it's more of a commentary about that person based on a lot of different sources. If any of you are in the humanities, such as English, you might be familiar with reading critical analyses of text, such as a critical analysis or a study of a novel or a short story or a play. That's also a secondary source of information. The primary source would actually be the original novel or short story or play. So a play by William Shakespeare is a primary source of information. An article that is analyzing the text or analyzing the themes of a specific play by William Shakespeare would be a secondary source of information. Also, again, in terms of the natural sciences or physical sciences or other disciplines of that nature, if I am reading a scholarly journal article that's more of a commentary about others who have done certain experiments, that journal article is actually a secondary source of information. Remember that the primary source is actually describing perhaps an experiment or a study that that author has himself or herself done. The secondary source could be a commentary about similar experiments. Sometimes that gets a little bit fuzzy, but there is a distinction between the two. Finally, this is one that you may not have heard of. This is the concept of a tertiary source of information. So we have primary, we have secondary, And now we have tertiary sources of information. Tertiary sources can be thought of as 2 steps removed from primary sources and perhaps 1 step removed from secondary sources. A tertiary source is a resource that will lead you to primary and secondary sources. The best way to think about a tertiary source could be something like the discovery search that we've already looked at from our library's webpage. Keep in mind that the discovery search will lead me to information about books or articles that could be available through the library. The ESU discovery source in and of itself is a tertiary source of information, but it's leading me to be able to discover primary and secondary sources. By the same token, a database will actually be a tertiary source of information that again would lead me to perhaps books or articles that could lead me to primary sources or secondary sources. So again, if I am interested in a particular topic, and you might remember in our previous module, I was doing opioid epidemic and public libraries. So when I searched in that database called Library and Information Science Source, that database was a tertiary source of information. Remember that it led me to articles about my topic. Other types of tertiary sources that can be thought of in different ways would be Google Scholar. So again, keep in mind that Google Scholar is a tertiary source of information, but it's going to lead me to information about journal articles about different topics. I have mentioned here something called Credo Reference. This is something we're going to be looking at later on. This is another example of a database that's available through William Allen White Library. And Credo Reference is actually, again, a tertiary source of information. In this instance, Credo Reference will lead me to articles from subject-specific works, like subject-specific encyclopedias. So I could use Credo Reference as a tertiary source of information to find an encyclopedia article about Elizabethan England during the time of William Shakespeare. I hope that makes sense. Bibliographies, so for example, if you have a bibliography or a reference list at the end of journal articles to search for more information, those bibliographies or those reference lists are actually tertiary sources of information because they are lists of journal articles or other sources that were used to write that article. These concepts will become a lot more familiar as you work with them more in our class. Chapter 4, Gather, also talks about different types of information formats. And of course, now we have a lot of social media as an information format. We still have newspaper articles that we might wind up consulting, and some of you may still read newspaper articles in print. Many newspapers now are available online, and I'm going to use our local newspaper, Emporia Gazette, as an example. You can access the PDFs or the electronic versions of issues of the Emporia Gazette, but there can be a limit. So part of gathering is also distinguishing between free sources of information and paid sources of information. We're kind of looking at this now. So with the Emporia Gazette, I would actually have to have a subscription either to the print newspaper or perhaps purely for the digital form to be able to access the complete PDF of an issue online. I can't just do that freely. So I can find my information in the Gazette, but I might have to pay for it one way or another. We've talked a little bit more about primary sources. We need to look at scholarly journal articles and books as other information formats. Now, with scholarly journal articles, we've talked again about the fact that we want you to use library databases. And one reason for that is that the library has already paid for access to those databases and also for a lot of online journals so that you as an ESU student don't really have to go ahead and pay for that in turn. And that's why we want you, again, to be familiar with what we have through the library. And this actually helps in terms of information literacy. Books, of course, we can access through our catalog. Some of you may be familiar with Google Books. You can find some full text of books through Google Books but often there will be a page limit on the number of pages that have been made available online for a book through Google Books. So it's really not like reading the entire book. So a lot of articles or a lot of books will depend upon your access and what you're willing to pay for or not. So you do always want to keep that in mind. Some of you may have a Kindle or other type of tablet. If you have access to ebooks through a library, for example, the State Library of Kansas makes a lot of electronic books that are fiction and nonfiction freely available if you reside in the state of Kansas, and you can read these ebooks online through a tablet or other device. That's provided free as a state of Kansas resident. If I wanted to read another type of ebook that perhaps I could purchase through Amazon, then I'm paying for that access. So we always have to be aware of what's freely available and what we're actually paying for, and how badly we actually need that information. So I wanted to give you an example of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources through another person that you might be familiar with. So a lot of you have probably heard of Anne Frank. Anne Frank, of course, was the young woman, the young teenager, who wrote a very famous diary while she and her family and some friends were in hiding in the Netherlands during the Second World War. Unfortunately, the family and the friends were discovered, and everyone wound up passing away except for her father, Otto, who actually was able to preserve the diary that she wrote after he was released from the concentration camp, and then was able to put it into publication, and it became very famous as The Diary of Anne Frank, or Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. So in print form, there are actually several versions of Anne Frank's diary. And surprisingly enough, if you have read Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl, that is the diary itself that she wrote, but it actually was rewritten by Anne herself. So what happened was, toward the end, right before the family was discovered in 1944, Anne and her family were listening to clandestine radio broadcasts, and she heard a broadcast that was talking about the fact that after the war ended, that the Dutch government actually was very interested in finding primary sources of information, such as diaries and letters and other texts that people who went through the war were keeping. And so they would have basically a way of preserving what people had actually gone through, war experiences. This really inspired Anne, and she'd been keeping her diaries since 1942 when the family first went into hiding. So she actually went back and began rewriting her earliest diary entries from 1942. And she was rewriting them with an eye toward publication. So it's very interesting. The reason that we know this is that in print now, this was published back in the late 1980s, there is a critical edition called The Diary of Anne Frank, the critical edition. We have this in our library. And the fascinating thing about that is that it is an actual reconstruction or an actual reprinting of the original diary of Anne Frank from 1942 to 1944 when they were found, and the rewriting that Anne was able to accomplish. She was able to rewrite most of her 1942 entries and part of 1943. Unfortunately, because she was discovered along with her family, she never had an opportunity to complete that. So the Diary of Anne Frank, the critical edition, is actually considered to be a primary source of information because it's the actual documents that Anne Frank wrote. Really interesting reading. In the 1950s, there was a play that was written that was called The Diary of Anne Frank. Interestingly enough, again, if I am just looking at the play itself, the play is a primary source in and of itself if I am analyzing the play. It could be a secondary source of information if I'm comparing it to the diary, but the play itself is a primary source of information. We're going to look at this virtual primary source in just a second, the secret annex online, because I also want to show you that primary sources, such as exhibits from special collections and archives, can be online as well as in person. A secondary source of information about Anne Frank could be biographies of her, things that people have actually written about her, or critical journal articles that analyze the diary or the play, or that talk about Anne Frank again as an individual. Tertiary source of information. Our library has a database called Literature Criticism Online. I can use Literature Criticism Online as a tertiary source to find these biographies and critical journal articles that have been written about Anne Frank's diary. So you see how this is working. So let's pause for a second, and I'm going to share another screen with you. Again, this is another way of thinking about a primary source of information. So Anne Frank and her family and family friends hid behind this bookcase in something called the secret annex. And this was actually part of a building where her father's office was located in the heart of Amsterdam. Very interesting. This bookcase actually pulled out, and then there was a staircase that was hidden behind the bookcase. When you went up the staircase, that's where you saw the rooms of the secret annex, and that was where they actually lived for 2 years until they were found. If we step inside, this is a way that I can look at a primary source of information. This is actually a primary source because I'm able to do a virtual tour of the secret annex without actually being there visiting in person. And when I do things like this, I can scroll down here, and you see that I am able to move my cursor and look at this tiny, tiny hallway and see how the bookcase opened. And when I click on that link, this is telling me a little bit more as the bookcase as a secret entrance. And there's a video that I can play that would talk about a bookcase as a secret door. And this is what I just find to be really fascinating. If I click back here, and I'm going to click on Step Inside again, that's going to open another tab. I'm back here. And now I can actually go up the steep staircase. I'm behind the bookcase now. And you see what this is doing? This is actually leading me to the rooms of the secret annex. And again, I can keep going here. And this is a virtual tour of the rooms where they hid. And I did want to spend just a little bit of time showing that to you because I think it's very important to think in terms of primary sources as items that are even just beyond print resources, such as diaries and letters. They can indeed exist as virtual exhibits. They can exist in many different ways. Depending upon the topic that you're researching for information literacy purposes, you may have to think about what primary and secondary and tertiary sources of information you need to dig down to the actual topic much more specifically. And you'll be doing this in the next few weeks. Thank you for watching this tutorial. We have one more tutorial that you're going to be watching in which I'm going to be going over our learning assessment, our next one, our research plan, plus a discussion for Plan and Gather that you can complete as an engagement activity this week, and also some information that I'm going to be sending out to you through email about 2 tests that you can take. Both of them are called the Threshold Achievement Test of Information Literacy. Stay tuned.